The new district attorney opposed the resentencing hearing, but the judge said, too late, I'm going to have it. The judge imposed a new sentence of, instead of life without possibility of parole, he imposed the sentence on the Menendez brothers for 50 years to life. Okay, so it's an indeterminate period type sentence, and you might think, okay, so what now? And that's what your listeners are all interested in.
Right.
Well, what now?
What does this mean? Welcome to Just Healing, where we rediscover humanity in our conversations around trauma and celebrate all the unique ways we love and heal. Hello and welcome to this next episode of Just Healing. Now, you've guys seen the lead up. You've seen some of the things that I've been doing, talking about certain cases that have been in the news. But we have a very, very, very special guest who's going to be talking to us about a lot of these questions that people are having. So, Jack, and I don't want to butcher your name, I tried earlier. Why don't you introduce yourself and your last name so people know who you are?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Deborah. I am Jack Einwechter. I'm a practicing civil litigation attorney here in Orange County and have my own firm. But I'm really happy to be here. I really congratulate you on this podcast, and especially I really like the name of your podcast, Just Healing, because the idea of justice and connecting with the idea of healing is so important in criminal justice and the purpose of punishment and penology. So I appreciate that, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you. I love that you caught that because, one of the things I do in the court is I like to tell people stories, right? And a lot of times people just want to get in and out and stick in this box and you do because you need a clean transcript. I get all of that from an attorney's point of view, but sometimes it helps if someone understands the person, right? And what's going on and the trauma that's kind of got them there,
Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah, we do need to understand the whole person. I mean, so our focus in these cases, criminal cases, looks at different foci, the offender, the victim, society. But we can't neglect the offender. We have to think about what got him there.
Right. It's a path, right? And so there's been like some cases in the news, especially the Menendez case, right? But they're talking about this term, and I want people to understand how sentencing works. People keep thinking they're just going to get released. This is not happening, right? And so can you please explain to people so they understand what sentencing even means and then what resentencing even means?
Yeah, those are good questions. It's a good starting place. Because, of course, the Menendez brothers were sentenced back in the 90s and have served 35 years in incarceration for the crimes of killing their parents. And it's a crime they don't deny, have never denied, actually, except when they were trying to avoid prosecution and spun their theory about the mafia hit and so on. But once they were accused and brought to trial, they admitted they killed their parents. And so, ultimately, after two trials, first jury was hung, and then they had a retrial. They were convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Now, the way a court sentences someone when they're convicted, in broad strokes, we don't want to go into the procedural niceties or details. And frankly, that's the best way for everyone to kind of approach this. But basically, after a verdict of guilty comes in, there's a separate hearing, a sentencing hearing, in which both the prosecution and defense have the opportunity to present evidence and witnesses and argument to the court, arguing for what they believe would be a just or appropriate sentence in the case. The prosecutor emphasizes aggravating factors, those aspects of the crime that were particularly important or salient for the judge to understand, in understanding the gravity, the harm of the offense. And then the defense, of course, emphasizes mitigating factors. And once the judge to understand the background of the offender, maybe, they have a clean record. Maybe they suffered childhood abuse or something of this nature that brought them to this horrible moment where they committed a crime. And so those kind of mitigating factors will come in on the defense side. The judge then has to apply the law, and the law gives the judge a lot of discretion. So the law will set out what the maximum sentence could be for various offenses. Sometimes it provides a range of sentences the judge could apply, and the judge will be expected to apply discretion in deciding what the appropriate sentence is based on all the evidence, facts, and argument presented by the opposing parties at the sentencing hearing. But the judge then will impose a sentence. Most heinous murders, in some cases, judges have the opportunity to impose a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, which is kind of a misnomer, as we'll discuss, and or the death penalty. And so the judge has a full range of everything from, in most felonies, everything from parole to, more serious terms of incarceration. So that's how the sentencing process works. But after sentencing, it's not the end of the story. It seems like it. And in these public, very high profile cases, we have, that moment of the verdict, which is so dramatic in Hollywood, but in real life too. And it seems like the end. Life without the possibility of parole, which was the sentence imposed in the Menendez case, sounds like the end. It sounds like they're in it forever. But there's a number of avenues whereby that sentence can be reduced, vacated, or a resentencing could occur. And most people are familiar with the ordinary tracks for getting to, a new outcome, a resentencing. There's, of course, the ordinary appeals that can be pursued. And then there's the habeas corpus procedures, whereby a convict can challenge procedural errors at their trial and so forth in an attempt to overturn the conviction or sentence. And that might get them back to court for a new trial or a resentencing. Another track would be executive clemency. Under the California Constitution, the governor has very broad authority to commute sentences, to pardon offenders, and so on. So those are two of the tracks whereby you can get to a new result after you've been sentenced. And the third one, which has been much in the news in the Menendez case, is this resentencing procedure. So under California law, someone serving a sentence can go back to court, and a new judge or the original judge can reconsider the case and resentence them based on, how they have done post-conviction. Their conduct during incarceration, any evidence that they are less of a threat to society, and so on. Based on everything, all the new evidence since the conviction happened, the judge can decide either to change the conviction to a lesser included offense or to reduce the sentence. Can never increase the sentence, can never increase the conviction. That would be double jeopardy.
Yes.
So in these resentencing hearings, it runs kind of like the original sentencing hearing. The prosecution and defense will present evidence and argument. The judge will then consider that. But unlike the original sentencing procedure, here the focus is more on what has happened since the original sentencing. The offenders shown genuine rehabilitation. Have they had a good disciplinary record during incarceration? Have they, improved themselves, their lives? Have they shown genuine remorse? Or have they gotten older? Have they suffered some kind of disability? Have they received psychological counseling or help that has fundamentally changed their ability to control their impulses and be less dangerous to society as an offender? So the judge then considers all that, considers the purposes of punishment, and imposes a new sentence. So that's kind of the overview, but it's not the end. It's never the end. You're going to hear this theme,
Yeah.
So as what happened in Menendez case is, a few weeks ago, the judge entertained a resentencing hearing because the district attorney of Los Angeles asked the court to do that. The new district attorney opposed the resentencing hearing, but the judge said, too late, I'm going to have it. The judge imposed a new sentence instead of life without possibility of parole, he imposed a sentence on the Menendez brothers for 50 years to life. Okay, so it's an indeterminate period type sentence, 50 years to life. And you might think, okay, so what now? And that's what your listeners are all interested
Right.
in. What now?
What does this mean?
What happened was, after the resentencing, a lot of people were like, okay, so what's the next step? The next step legally is the parole board has the opportunity to consider the case based on the resentencing. The parole board was not involved in the Menendez case until the resentencing. Why? Well, because they had a sentence that made them ineligible for parole consideration. Life without the possibility of parole means life without the possibility of parole. Doesn't really mean that, because it means life without the possibility of parole unless you're resentenced or you succeed on appeal or you get clemency or
See,
habeas. So there's many ways. But as long as that remains the sentence on the books, they were not eligible for parole.
mhm.
Okay. But once the judge resentenced them to 50 to life, they were immediately eligible for parole consideration because of a California law called the youthful offender law, which, because they were 18 and 21 at the time of their offense, and they were younger than 26 when they committed the offense, you're eligible for parole in those circumstances if you've served at least half of your minimum sentence. So they've been in for 35 years. So 25 would have been half their minimum sentence under the resentencing. So they were immediately eligible for parole consideration. And initially, their hearing was set for June 13th, and that was Governor Newsom's doing. A couple months ago, he actually set a June 13th hearing with the parole board because he wanted the parole board to make a recommendation on executive clemency. Remember, that's a different track from the resentencing track, that's the clemency track. So when they were resentenced, Gavin Newsom announced, well, that clemency hearing at the parole board will now become a parole hearing.
Mm.
And so that was what we thought was going to happen. It didn't actually happen because the parole board decided to postpone the hearing until late August. Why did they do that? Well, they have a lot of discretion on the timing. And I think they did that because they wanted time to think about it, to review the file, maybe do some background investigation, to gather all the documents related to their incarceration conduct and everything else. So they want everyone to take a breath and give the board time to consider the whole picture. So it's now set for late August, and the board will have a hearing, two separate hearings actually, one for Lyle, one for
Eric.
Eric, and then they'll make a recommendation or a finding in each case for whether they're eligible or should be released on parole.
Well, you said a couple of things that I don't think people quite got, because I don't want people thinking every single person who gets this resentencing is eligible under youthful offender. It's not. There's an age limit to this, and it's because of developmental issues, and they think that, you're still developing at that time, correct?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So the youthful offender law is, really important here. Of course, they were 18 and 21 at the time of the convictions. They're not children. They were adults, legally
Yes.
and actually. They were not children when it happened, but the youthful offender law sets the threshold at age 26.
Hmm.
You're under age 26 when you're convicted, you have a different parole eligibility schedule. So that did happen.
Right. And so, because people think, oh my God, I can, he's 35, he can go. And no, 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 it doesn't work that way. And it's because they're trying to look at people as they grow and as they developed, right? And you talked about how your behavior in prison plays a role into the parole board, right? Because you can't be doing things in there and then say, oh, I want to be released under this, right?
That's right. The parole board's really interested in what has happened to the offender since their conviction and during their incarceration, because I think it's fair to say the primary consideration of the parole board is to ascertain whether the person, the offender, poses a continuing risk to society. They will not release someone on parole if they believe or if their conduct in prison indicates that they still have potential for violence and remain a threat to society. They're just never going to release someone. So they want to see how they did in prison. Did they have a good disciplinary record? Did they try to improve themselves? Did they undergo medical, psychological counseling and all that kind of thing? That's the focus of the parole board. So, yeah.
Right. And they have to go through a lot of evaluations. They don't just get released, right? What do you think of offenders with mental health disorders? And it used to be called the mentally disordered offender, and it's under PC 2962.
Yes.
And you have to go through a lot of things to be able to be released, and a psychologist has to evaluate you.
That's right. So the mentally disordered offender program, every
Mhm.
state in the country has a program like this. And it's a program that's designed to create some safeguards and some process whereby offenders who have severe mental issues or disorders and pose a continuing risk to society based or because of those disorders may need to be committed involuntarily to long-term care in a state mental hospital. Instead of being released upon completion of their term of incarceration, many of them will be diverted into involuntary commitment, which is similar to prison, except that it has this additional care, mental health care component to it. It's a scary thing to a lot of people because it's the idea that society, purely for preventive detention, can hold someone uh, in what amounts to incarceration indefinitely until the state decides that they are not dangerous anymore or that their mental disorder is no longer deemed a severe mental disorder or something of that nature. So it's a little bit scary, the idea that the state can decide you're just dangerous because you have a mental disorder. And so you're going to be diverted to state hospital and spend an indefinite period. It's not like you're in prison where you have a sentence. It says you can get out. This is conditions based.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's
So it
condition.
might go that way. But to kind of complete the discussion about the process, after the parole board makes a recommendation on release, let's say at the end of August, Lyle and Eric are recommended for parole. After that, they don't get automatically released either. There's a 30-day period during which the governor can consider and can consider the case and issue an order, either for release or retention in jail. So the judge or the governor can decide that the parole board got it wrong and they have to stay in jail. Uh, yeah, so he has 30 days. If he does nothing, the parole board's recommendation becomes the ruling, and they will be, processed for release, unless, as you say, they're diverted into some other program.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem likely in this case.
No, it doesn't seem likely, but people have to realize they don't just get released. There are so many steps to letting someone back out in society. I mean, they have to prove that they did everything they're supposed to do, that they followed, if they had mental health, if they went to their appointments. Like, I mean, they have a plan for their future, right? If there's people in their home, who are they going to live with? Are they a threat to those people? Like, there is so many hoops. Like, and while they were in prison, what were they doing? Were they getting tickets? Meaning, were they getting infractions? And what were the infractions for? Were they serious? Were they violent? Like, all of these things go into that decision. And a lot of people in social media are saying, oh, they're going to get released. That's it. Everything. And it's like, no, don't start throwing stuff out the window. What was it? Joe Exotic rolled and there was a limo waiting outside. Don't
Yeah.
put the limo outside the door right now.
No, in fact, I'd say probably the earliest they could be released would be October or November if they're going to be released. It's possible they won't be released, although I think they probably will be. I think, Governor Newsom probably uh, senses the public kind of general public mood and attitude toward this case and won't feel the sort of intense pressure to disapprove a parole release that he might feel in a case like, the Manson family murders or the Sirhan, assassination of Robert Kennedy and other cases like that. High profile, premeditated murder, oftentimes governors disapprove parole boards, but parole boards, they're not pushovers. You got to really persuade
hmm
them that,
Yeah, it's hard.
you know,
It's hard. Yeah. And do you think that, like, people want to say, oh, social media did this, TikTok did this, like Instagram did this. They can have whatever influence they want, but there's people on that parole board are looking for certain things.
it's an interesting point, especially in the social media world that we live in, because the parole board is allowed to
hmm
document and consider public comment on a case. And if there's a tremendous outcry, particularly a victim-based kind of outcry against release in a certain case, that can be influential and could influence a parole board to deny parole. So there's a lot of precedent for that, as I mentioned, two leading cases, but Scott Peterson probably falls in the category. And throughout history, Americans have an insatiable appetite for high-profile criminal cases. We always have, from Lizzie Borden, Sacco and Vanzetti, the Rosenberg case in the Cold War. We have always loved these cases. It's like the ultimate reality TV, and Americans just eat it up. But in a way, that's funny, but we can't minimize the long-term, profound impact that this kind of intense public scrutiny and interest in a high-profile case has on public attitudes toward penal policy, criminal justice, and so on. And those are really important attitude tides that come and go, as you know. The pendulum swings all the time. A high-profile case might be followed by a series of bills in the legislature to impose stricter sentences because the mood of the public is for more law and order or less, more public safety. And so these are really important cases. And this was one of the first ones. This is one of Court TV's, the Menendez case, one of Court TV's first big media sensations.
It was, and it still is, right? And it's blowing up. But do you think that, because this is the first case, to be honest with you, that talked about male survivor trauma and violence, right? And talked about sexual abuse and molestation,
Yeah.
incestual sexual abuse, right? This is the case that made me go into this field, believe it or not. Like, I was in the 80s, I was still in school, I think I was maybe in junior high, okay? And I watched this whole thing and I said, oh my God, there was sexual abuse. Like, I don't know how I knew. I was like, they didn't do this just to do this. They did this to stop something. And I remember that I was just like watching this glued to the TV, but it was the first case anyone had ever talked about it. So I'm wondering has people's perspective and understanding of that changed to have led to this?
Yeah, I think it was a seminal case in that regard because, it had a huge impact and it made people stop and say, okay, so what do we really think about, this kind of childhood abuse that the defense asserted at trial? A lot of people believe that there was abuse and that, it played some role in the crime. What I would encourage people to remember, though, is that you have to remember what the defense said about this.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't say the sexual abuse caused the crime. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, society will never tolerate that kind of theory. What they said was the sexual abuse created a psychological environment in which the Menendez brothers threatened their parents that they were going to expose the history of abuse and that they were therefore threatened by the parents, with dire consequences, with death. They were threatened to kill them, they said. And that based on that threat to be killed for revealing the abuse, they got shotguns and killed their parents. They asserted what's called an imperfect self-defense theory. They weren't saying we should be excused because there was abuse. They're saying we should face only voluntary manslaughter rather than murder because we honestly believed that they were going to kill us for revealing the abuse. So it's kind of an important distinction to make because, abuse, as horrible as it is, doesn't justify, murder. But it's certainly a huge mitigating factor at sentencing. And, to the extent the evidence is credible and a court believes it, oftentimes courts, I think, do. And I think do take it into account. It is a big mitigating factor. It can explain what appears to be just utterly inexplicable violence. I mean, this was a horrible crime. This was a calculated use of shotguns to slaughter two people in the most brutal way. And we can't forget that. We have to remember the crime. All criminal justice cases start there. It kind of sets the parameters for how severe the punishment will be and how we understand the process that follows. So, yeah, it's a big case. And it's interesting that it was so important in your life.
It was, oh my gosh, it really shaped who I was,
Yeah.
and what path I was really taking in my career because I was always like how come they're not considering this, or how come they're not realizing? And yes, people died, but there was an environmental structure that created this fear that was going on, and I saw that like right away, and I don't even know how I knew that. But people say careers find the person, and I
Yeah,
think that that's what happened with
yeah,
me. You
yeah. I
know.
was I was in law school when the trial started,
Hmm.
and I think the second trial happened after I graduated. But yeah, I was keenly interested in it from the standpoint of criminal law and penology, and knew that I was going to be a prosecutor. So I watched it with very keen interest. So it also affected me in that way.
Hmm.
But Americans get really caught up in these cases, they really do. And it's not a bad thing. I just think that, it's important for people to be fair and think about these things, in a comprehensive way, in a way that takes into account both sides, the government's prosecution perspective, the defense. You don't have to take a position on the Menendez, case. Just think about it, and be honest with yourself about why certain elements in this case, certain factual elements, sway you one way or another.
Right. And if people could do that, then they could see, the forest for the trees sometimes. Because I don't think people realize whatever your belief is, this case was pivotal for the legal system, right?
Mhm.
And what do you think the resentencing is going to do for other cases that are going to follow? Because, once you get one, it starts, snowballing. So what do you think is going to happen?
On a number of levels. I mean, one, it will certainly produce some new proposed legislation about how this process should work from people on both sides, maybe. Although Garagos said that the Menendez defense attorney said in the resentencing process, he said, it's like the resentencing statute was written for the Menendez case. It fit it so perfectly. So I think on one level, there'll be some legislative action, in a number of ways. I think it will also provide a precedent for other defendants seeking resentencing, that it'll give their attorneys something to chew on the way this process unfolded, and will set some kind of precedent for how they might approach their own case. So it'll be important that way. And then it kind of brought to the surface again all of the passion, all of the beliefs, all of the thinking and commentary that went into the Menendez trials originally. So a lot of us, my age, are kind of revisiting the way we thought about it many, many years ago, and so it will definitely have an effect.
Yeah, it had an effect. I mean, it's having an effect on so many people. I mean, if you look at their TikTok following and their social media, it's just affecting people. But I have so many people who are male survivors talk about this and saying that could have been me and all this stuff. So it's definitely done something for our culture.
Yeah, I understand that perspective, and it's vitally important. What the work you do is vitally important, and I think it is important for us to think about how we handle offenders who have that traumatic past. It doesn't mean that the law should or will excuse them, but it should certainly be a factor that has a formal part in the process. I mean, my personal view is that, what's compelling to me. I think what gets lost is Kitty Menendez. I understand all the allegations against Jose, but there are two victims here. That she should suffer this horrible death because of what her husband did. She knew about it and didn't bring it to light, or there may be some culpability there. She was either innocent or perhaps abused herself, emotionally or otherwise. And we can't forget the victims. We can never forget the victims and how important that is. So my advice to people is, don't get too caught up in this. If they get released, I trust the process. Yeah, I know my view on the case maybe differs from a lot of people, but I just wanted to get that in because I think it's important to remember. It's just, I can't get past that. Sorry.
Everybody has a different perspective, and that's what makes this show different, right? We just showed one side of the coin and stuck with it. I mean, that wouldn't be the show I want, right? I want other people to have unique perspectives in that. And so thank you for bringing that here. And is there anything else that you want to leave us with?
Well, I think just, again, that this case does does force us to think about this issue of trauma and childhood abuse and this kind of interfamilial abuse and the effect it has on offenders, and what the justice system should do about it, and how the justice system should reckon with offenders who have suffered this way. And so I think it's a really important case. I would just urge everybody to think really deeply about it, about crime and punishment in general, and to be fair, to think about both sides.
I agree. You've given me some food for thought. And thank you for being on this episode of Just Healing.
Thank you very much for having me.